This insolence ends now. Do you hear me?
Your tyranny holds no sway over me any longer. I choose my own path.
The discovery came on a humid afternoon in July 2019, when a graduate student cataloging the archives of the Georgia Historical Society lifted a leather-bound ledger from a cardboard box marked Harrow Estate Records, 1840-1865. The volume itself was unremarkable. Columns of names, ages, monetary values, the brutal arithmetic of human commerce rendered in sepia ink. But there, on page 47, squeezed into the narrow margin beside a list of field hands, was a notation that would unravel a family's carefully maintained myth. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time you hit the play button. Purchased back, age 11, SH 425. The entry was dated March 1854. The handwriting, cramped and hurried, differed from the meticulous copperplate that filled the rest of the page. Someone had added this note later, perhaps years later, as if compelled to mark a transaction that official records couldn't quite capture. The initials SH appeared nowhere else in the volume, yet the buyer's name was rendered in full at the bottom of the page. Colonel Silas Montgomery Harrow, a man whose marble bust still presided over the Savannah Veterans Memorial, whose generous endowments had built 3 churches and a hospital, whose reputation for honor and Christian charity had survived intact through Reconstruction and into the 20th century. How does a man of such standing come to purchase back a child? The phrasing itself was peculiar, not simply purchased, but purchased back, implying prior ownership, a claim that transcended the commercial transaction. The price, too, was notable. $425 was substantially above market rate for an 11-year-old boy in 1854, when field hands typically sold for $300 to $600, depending on age and constitution. Someone had paid premium for this particular child. Cross-referencing the date with other Harrow documents yielded another fragment. In the baptism register of Christ Church, Savannah, dated April 1854, appeared the name Samuel Harrow, age given as approx. 11 years, race listed as mulatto, and sponsor recorded as Miss Eleanor Harrow by proxy of Colonel S.M. Harrow. Eleanor Harrow was the colonel's only daughter, unmarried, 28 years old, in 1854. Why would an unmarried woman of her station sponsor the baptism of an enslaved mulatto boy? And why, most significantly, would that boy carry the Harrow surname, a privilege almost never extended to enslaved people, even those who might have been fathered by their masters? The archival anomaly raised questions that conventional narratives of antebellum Southern society struggled to contain. This was not a story of plantation paternalism or benevolent masters extending Christian charity to their human property. The margin note, with its suggestion of repurchase, implied something far more troubling: a prior relationship, a severing, and then a reclaiming. And the baptismal record suggested that this was no ordinary enslaved child, but one whose connection to the Harrow family demanded acknowledgement, however coded and incomplete. The Harrow estate, known as Marshfield, stretched across 2,000 acres of coastal Georgia's most productive rice-growing land. From the river road, visitors approached through an avenue of live oaks draped in Spanish moss, emerging into a vista of calculated grandeur. A 3-story mansion of Savannah gray brick with a double-gallery portico supported by Doric columns, formal gardens geometrically arranged around a central fountain, and in the distance, the neat rectangles of rice fields where enslaved workers moved in choreographed rows behind the trunks that controlled the tidal flooding. Colonel Silas Harrow had inherited the property from his father in 1828 and transformed it from a profitable but unremarkable plantation into a showplace of coastal aristocracy. By the 1840s, Marshfield enslaved more than 200 people, produced 40,000 pounds of rice annually, and served as a model of what planters like to call scientific agriculture. The colonel's reputation extended beyond agricultural success. He had served with distinction in the Seminole Wars, sat on the board of the Georgia Historical Society, and donated generously to causes both civic and religious. His dinner parties attracted governors and senators. His opinions on tariffs and territorial expansion appeared in Charleston and Savannah newspapers. Yet the house itself held secrets that no amount of marble and magnolia could entirely obscure. The enslaved community at Marshfield spoke in whispers of the west wing of the great house, where Miss Eleanor's rooms faced the garden, and where, in the summer of 1843, the shutters remained closed for weeks. Kitchen workers reported trays sent up and returned barely touched, strange sounds in the night that were not quite weeping and not quite screaming. The midwife, a free woman of color named Judith Pratt, who attended most births in the district, was summoned to Marshfield in late July and departed before dawn with a leather purse that clinked with gold coins, payment for her services, and it was understood, her silence. What happened in those shuttered rooms became the subject of carefully suppressed gossip. The enslaved community possessed an intelligence network that plantation owners perpetually underestimated. Information passed through looks and silences, through work songs whose lyrics carried double meanings, through the nocturnal visits between plantations that occurred beyond the surveillance of overseers. The domestic servants at Marshfield knew that Miss Eleanor, then 17 years old, had been confined to her rooms during the hottest weeks of summer, attended only by her mother and the midwife, and that when she finally emerged in early September, she was pale and hollow-eyed and spoke to no one for days. The baby born that summer was never announced, never celebrated, never formally acknowledged. There was no christening, no presentation to family and neighbors, none of the rituals that typically marked the arrival of a white child into a plantation family. Instead, in the small hours of an August morning, a bundle wrapped in linen was carried from the house by a trusted overseer and handed to a wet nurse in the quarters. A woman whose own infant had died in childbirth the week before, her breasts still full and aching. The child stayed in the quarters for 6 weeks, nursed alongside enslaved infants, while Miss Eleanor remained in the main house, recovering in body if not in spirit. By October 1843, the infant had vanished from Marshfield entirely. The wet nurse would later tell her daughter that men had come in the night, that the baby had been taken wrapped in a grain sack, that she had been warned never to speak of it on pain of sale away from her own remaining children. Miss Eleanor returned to social circulation that winter, attending parties and church services with a frozen smile that her mother explained away as the lingering effects of a mysterious illness. No one asked awkward questions. In the intricate social choreography of the planter class, certain silences were maintained as rigorously as certain proprieties. The father of Eleanor's child was never named in any surviving document, but household accounts from that period show regular payments to a tutor who had been hired in 1842 to instruct Miss Eleanor in French and drawing, a young man from Savannah whose employment ended abruptly in June 1843. He appears nowhere in subsequent records, suggesting either death or hurried departure from Georgia entirely. Whether the liaison was consensual in any meaningful sense, whether a 17-year-old girl subordinate to her parents' authority could truly consent to a relationship with an employee of her father's household, remains a question that the historical record cannot definitively answer. What is certain is that the Harrow family deployed every resource at their disposal to erase this scandal from public knowledge. The child was removed, the mother's reputation preserved through months of calculated social appearances, and the machinery of polite silence ensured that no whisper reached the newspapers or letter collections that would constitute the official record. Yet in the hidden transcript of the enslaved community, the story survived, told and retold, a parable about the hypocrisy of the white gentry who preached virtue while practicing expedience. Eleanor Harrow existed in the historical record, primarily through the male figures who defined her. Dutiful daughter of the colonel, sister to a brother who died young, eventually an unmarried woman whose charity work and church attendance marked her as a figure of feminine propriety. The conventions of antebellum life left few spaces where elite white women could record their own voices, their own experiences, unmediated by patriarchal authority. What survives of Eleanor herself comes in fragments. A packet of letters discovered in a trunk in 1973. A diary whose first 30 pages had been torn out and burned. Marginal notes in books from the Marshfield Library. The letters, written between Eleanor and her cousin Margaret in Charleston, begin innocuously enough with discussions of fashion, mutual acquaintances, and the tedium of plantation life. But in April 1843, a new note enters Eleanor's correspondence. I find myself often unwell in the mornings, dear cousin, and cannot take breakfast without distress. Mother attributes it to the spring humidity, but I confess myself increasingly anxious. By June, the letters cease entirely for 3 months. A silence that Margaret's responses show caused considerable concern. Your mother writes that you are much improved, Margaret notes in August, yet she does not say improved from what, nor when we might expect your return to society. The diary, kept in Eleanor's careful script, survives only from October 1843 onward, the first pages physically removed, leaving ragged edges in the binding where something had been torn away. The extant entries begin with a cryptic passage. I am told I must resume my life, as if the summer were merely a season like any other, as if loss were something from which one recovers, as from an ague. Mother speaks of time's healing properties. Father does not speak to me at all. Throughout the winter of 1843 to 1844, Eleanor recorded a life of suffocating routine. Church services, sewing circles, plantation dinners where conversation revolved around rice prices and tariffs, while she sat silent, picking at her food. One entry, dated February 14th, 1844, breaks through the monotone of social observance. I dreamed again of small hands, of eyes that had not yet learned to focus, of a weight against my breast that I was permitted to feel for not more than an hour before he was taken away. Mother says such dreams will fade. Father says I must never speak of them. But in sleep, I am not obedient. In sleep, I am only a mother who does not know where her child sleeps, or if he sleeps at all, or if anyone holds him when he cries. The entry ends there. The following page has been torn out. Servant's testimony, recorded decades later by a WPA interviewer, collecting narratives from formerly enslaved people, provides details that Eleanor herself could never have written openly. Flora Mason, who had worked in the Marshfield house as a teenager, recalled, Miss Eleanor, she changed after that summer. Used to be she'd laugh sometimes, play the pianoforte in the evening. After, she just sat by her window looking out at nothing. And every time a baby cried anywhere in the quarters, she'd turn her head quick-like, listening. Mrs. Harrow, she'd see that and call Miss Eleanor back to her needlework, real sharp-voiced. Another formerly enslaved person, Samuel Gadsden, remembered being sent to the Marshfield quarters in 1850 to work in the gardens. There was a story the old folks told about a baby born in the big house, a white child given to a colored woman to nurse, then sold away before he could even walk proper. They said Miss Eleanor would sometimes walk down toward the quarters at night, just stand at the edge of the yard, staring at the cabins. Her mother always came to fetch her back. The old people said she was looking for her boy, but that boy was long gone by then. The psychological toll of this enforced silence, this coerced complicity in the erasure of her own child, marked Eleanor permanently. Her later letters to Margaret become increasingly preoccupied with themes of Christian redemption and maternal suffering. She copied out passages from Luke 1:46-55, the Magnificat, Mary's song, and underlined the verse, "He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly." She attended every baptism at Christ Church, standing at the back in black silk, regardless of the season. Acquaintances noted her particular interest in charitable works, benefiting children, though her father prohibited her from teaching enslaved children to read, insisting that such activities were both illegal and improper. In 1852, Eleanor was briefly engaged to a widower from Charleston, but the engagement was broken under circumstances never explained. Her cousin Margaret wrote anxiously seeking details, but Eleanor responded only, "I find I cannot make the promises required of a wife when my heart remains hostage to matters I am forbidden to name. It is better that Mr. Preston find a bride less encumbered by history." She remained unmarried, living in the Marshfield house under her parents' authority, her life a monument to the violence that patriarchal power could inflict, even upon daughters of privilege. The bill of sale, preserved in the records of a Savannah auction house, was dated October 15th, 1843, just 6 weeks after the birth in the shuttered room. The document, rendered in the standardized language of human trafficking, described the merchandise with clinical precision. 1 mulatto male child, age approx. 2 months, unnamed, sound of limb, purchased this day by Mr. Josiah Crane, agent, for the sum of $240 in gold coin. Seller, Colonel S.M. Harrow, Marshfield Plantation, by proxy of Mr. Robert Ashe, overseer. $240 was an unusual price for an infant. Children under 5 had minimal market value. They required years of feeding and care before they could perform productive labor, and infant mortality rates among the enslaved population ran above 40%. Most infants were simply listed as part of their mother's value, incrementally increasing her price until the child reached working age. That Colonel Harrow would take the trouble to sell the baby separately, rather than simply adding him to the property inventory, or even quietly killing him, suggested a calculated decision. This child's existence needed to be documented and legitimized through commercial transaction, removed from Marshfield through channels that would appear routine and legal. Josiah Crane operated a trading firm that specialized in fancy enslaved people, individuals whose light skin, youth, or physical appearance made them particularly valuable in certain markets. His business records, preserved at the Georgia Historical Society, show his preference for children and young women who could be sold into domestic service in Charleston, New Orleans, or Caribbean markets, where color gradations carried particular social significance. The infants he purchased typically came from situations like this one. Children born of liaisons between white men and enslaved women, sold away before they could become visible evidence of plantation sexual exploitation. Crane's journal contains a rare personal note about the transaction. Received infant male from Harrow property, remarkably light complexion, gray eyes unusual in Negro child. Seller insisted on private sale, payment in gold rather than draft. Something irregular in the business, Child's features too refined, seller too anxious for quick transfer. Paid premium for immediate removal from district. Child to wet nurse in Savannah for 6 months before resale. Those grey eyes, remarked upon by a trader accustomed to evaluating human merchandise, matched Eleanor Harrow's precisely. A detail preserved in the portrait, painted of her at age 20, where the artist captured irises the color of winter sky. Such distinctive features became dangerous evidence in a society that depended on rigid racial categories to justify enslavement. A child whose appearance too closely resembled the white family from which he descended threatened the fundamental fiction of racial distinction upon which the entire system rested. The baby was moved to Savannah and placed with a wet nurse in the city's marginal neighborhood near the docks, where free people of color and enslaved people, hired out by their owners, created a semi-autonomous community beyond direct planter surveillance. For 6 months, the infant existed in this liminal space, nursed by a woman who was paid monthly by Crane's firm to keep the child fed and alive until he could be profitably resold. No name appears in any record from this period. He was simply the Harrow infant, or the mulatto male child from Marshfield, in the brief notations of payment records. In April 1844, when the child was approximately 8 months old, Crane sold him to a rice planter named Thomas Middleton for $280. The price increased slightly now that the child had survived infancy and could be reasonably expected to live to working age. Middleton's plantation, Oakmont, was situated 40 miles upriver from Marshfield, close enough that coastal networks of gossip could potentially carry the story of the child's origins, yet far enough that casual observation would be unlikely. For Colonel Harrow, the transaction represented a calculated risk. The child was removed from immediate danger of recognition, yet remained within a geographic sphere where Harrow's influence and intelligence network could potentially track him. Middleton's plantation records show the child listed simply as Sam in the 1845 inventory, not yet with a surname, not yet fully individuated from the dozens of other enslaved children enumerated by age, gender, and monetary value. The notation beside his name read, "House training commenced," suggesting that even at a year old, his destiny was being shaped by the lightness of his skin, directed toward domestic service rather than field labor. In the brutal calculus of slavery, Sam's appearance became simultaneously his burden and his marginal privilege. He would be spared some of the field's harshest labor, but would remain forever visible, forever subject to scrutiny, his body a constant reminder of the system's foundational violence. Between 1844 and 1854, the child known as Sam moved through a shadow world that left only fragmentary traces in the historical record. This was the characteristic experience of enslaved childhood, a condition of legal non-existence, punctuated by occasional documentary moments when bodies became subjects of commercial or legal notation. For most enslaved children, biography was impossible. They existed collectively as increase, as future labor, as property that would mature into greater value. Individual lives, individual experiences, vanished into the undifferentiated category of the enslaved. The few traces that survive suggest a childhood defined by disruption and ambiguity. Middleton's plantation records show Sam, mulatto boy, listed in inventories through 1848, valued increasingly as he aged, $350 at age 4, $450 at age 6. But in 1849, his name disappears from Oakmont's books. Cross-referencing with regional estate sales and auction records yields a possible explanation. Thomas Middleton died in February 1849, and his property was liquidated to settle debts. An auction notice in the Savannah Republican lists household effects, field implements, and sundry Negroes to be sold on April 15th, 1849. A fragment of a work contract, discovered among papers of a Savannah merchant, shows agreement for the hire of one Sam Mulatto, age approx. 7 years, for service in household and errands, $60 per annum, clothing and board provided by hirer, medical expenses by owner. The document is signed with an X mark by the owner, an illiterate or semi-literate person, or possibly someone who wished to remain anonymous in the transaction. The hirer was Jacob Morrison, a cotton factor who maintained offices near the Savannah docks and employed several enslaved people in his warehouses and household. Working for Morrison would have exposed Sam to the bustling commercial life of a port city. The ships arriving from Charleston, New York, Liverpool with manufactured goods, and departing with cotton and rice. The rough democracy of the docks where enslaved and free black workers, white laborers, sailors of every nation, mingled in spaces less rigidly policed than the plantation world. It was in such urban spaces that literacy sometimes became possible for enslaved people, acquired through observation and illicit instruction. Church basements, market corners, and dockside conversations became informal schools where knowledge circulated despite laws criminalizing black literacy. A runaway notice published in the Savannah Georgian in July 1851 may reference Sam, though the identification is uncertain. Runaway, from the subscriber, a mulatto boy named Sam, age about 9 years, light complexion, grey eyes, bright and quick, speaks proper English, suspected of learning to read, may attempt to pass for free, $25 reward for return to Jacob Morrison, Bay Street. The notice suggests a child of unusual capability and daring, bright enough to seem dangerous, light enough to blur racial categories, literate enough to imagine alternatives to enslavement. Whether this runaway notice refers to the same Sam who would later be purchased by Colonel Harrow remains uncertain. If it does, the runaway attempt failed. Most did, in a society structured around surveillance and the policing of black mobility. But the attempt itself, the willingness to risk everything for freedom at age 9, reveals a spirit that the system could not entirely crush. And the mention of literacy suggests that Sam had found ways to acquire forbidden knowledge, the kind of knowledge that made enslavement intellectually unbearable, even when physical escape proved impossible. A baptismal record from the First African Baptist Church in Savannah, dated November 1852, lists Samuel, boy of about 10 years, mulatto, sponsored by Cato Morrison, possibly an enslaved man working for Jacob Morrison's household. The absence of a surname is typical for enslaved people at baptism, yet the act of baptism itself represented a claim to spiritual identity beyond the master's legal definition. In black Christian theology of the antebellum period, baptism marked entrance into a community of faith that transcended earthly enslavement, all souls equal before God, regardless of the law's categorizations. From November 1852 until March 1854, Sam again disappears from documentation. These gaps, these silences, characterize enslaved life. Most moments left no mark, most days no record. We know he survived because he appears again in 1854, standing on an auction block in Savannah, about to enter the most peculiar phase of his short, constrained life. But the child who stood there at age 11 bore psychological scars that no document recorded, the accumulated trauma of being sold repeatedly, of forming and losing attachments, of learning that his body belonged to others, and that stability was an illusion that could shatter with a signature or a debt. March 17th, 1854, dawned cool and overcast in Savannah. At the auction house operated by Wilkins and Monroe on Broughton Street, enslaved people were displayed to prospective buyers as they had been every Friday for decades. Bodies examined like livestock, teeth checked, muscles palpated, questions asked about health and temperament, while the people being sold stood silent or answered carefully, knowing that the wrong word could affect their price, and therefore their destination. Among those for sale that morning was a boy listed in the catalogue as Sam, mulatto male, age 11, bright, healthy, suitable for house service, 375 or best offer. Several buyers examined Sam that morning. The auction house ledger notes interest from 3 different parties: a Charleston merchant seeking a houseboy, a rice planter restocking after a smallpox outbreak had killed several enslaved children, and Cole S.M. Harrow, Marshfield. According to the clerk's notation, Colonel Harrow arrived late, just as the bidding was to commence, and immediately took a position near the platform where he could see the boy clearly. A witness account, preserved in a letter written by a northern merchant who happened to be present, describes the scene. I observed an older gentleman, distinguished in bearing, fix his gaze upon a light-skinned boy of perhaps 11 years. The intensity of his attention was remarkable. He did not examine the child's teeth or physique as other buyers did, but simply stared at the boy's face with an expression I could not interpret. When bidding commenced, he immediately offered above the asking price, silencing other interested parties. The transaction concluded in less than 5 minutes. The final price was $425, the same figure noted in the margin of Harrow's ledger. This was approximately $50 above market rate for a child of Sam's age and category. Harrow paid in cash, unusual for a transaction of this size, which would typically be conducted through bank draft. He also insisted on immediate transfer of custody, refusing the auction house's standard practice of holding purchased people overnight for paperwork completion. By noon, Sam was traveling in a wagon toward Marshfield, sitting beside the overseer who had collected him, leaving behind whatever fragmentary life he had constructed in Savannah. Whether Sam recognized Harrow is unknown. Whether the 11-year-old boy could possibly remember being carried away as an infant from this same plantation is unlikely. But something in the transaction unsettled witnesses enough that they remarked upon it in letters and journals. The northern merchant noted, "The boy's expression when claimed was one of profound confusion. I wondered whether he had been sold away from family, though no one accompanied him to protest." The colonel addressed him once, saying only, "You're coming home," which struck me as peculiar phrasing for property newly purchased. Back at Marshfield, Sam's arrival was noted by the Etienne enslaved community with intense interest. Flora Mason, interviewed in the 1930s, recalled, "Word came down to the quarters that the colonel had bought a boy at auction in Savannah, and that boy was being kept up at the big house, not sent to the quarters like usual. We all knew something strange was happening. My mother, she looked at that boy when he was brought through, and she went white. Said he had Miss Eleanor's eyes, the same shade exactly. That's when the old folks started talking about the baby born in summer, the one they said had been sold away years before." The sleeping arrangements revealed the ambiguity of Sam's status. He was not housed in the slave quarters with the other children, nor was he given a room in the big house proper. Instead, Harrow ordered a small outbuilding behind the main house, originally a storage shed, to be fitted with a cot, a small stove, and a lockable door. Sam slept there alone, neither fully incorporated into the enslaved community, nor acknowledged as household kin, existing in a spatial limbo that reflected his genealogical impossibility. Miss Eleanor's absence during Sam's arrival was remarked upon by several people. She had been sent to Charleston to visit her cousin Margaret, just days before the Savannah auction, a visit that letters show had not been previously planned. She remained in Charleston for 2 months, returning only in May 1854. Her first encounter with Sam, when it occurred, left no direct record, but Flora Mason remembered. Miss Eleanor came back from Charleston, and one morning she saw that boy in the garden. She stopped walking, just froze in place, staring at him. Then she turned around fast and went back in the house. Didn't come out the rest of that day. The correspondence between Colonel Harrow and his overseer, Robert Ashe, documents the years 1854-1860 with unusual detail, preserved because Harrow was frequently away from Marshfield on business and maintained tight control over plantation management through written directives. These letters reveal an obsessive attention to one particular enslaved child, attention that exceeded any rational economic calculation and suggested motivations that the colonel could never openly acknowledge. In June 1854, 3 months after purchasing Sam, Harrow wrote to Ashe, "The boy is to be instructed in reading and arithmetic. I am aware this violates Georgia law, but you will ensure it is done discreetly. Mr. Patterson, the tutor from Savannah, will come twice weekly. The boy is to be clean, properly dressed, and ready for instruction. Any whipping or harsh discipline requires my direct approval." The letter reflects extraordinary privilege for an enslaved child. Literacy instruction risked criminal prosecution, and the requirement for direct approval before corporal punishment was virtually unprecedented in plantation management. Ashe's response, preserved in the Harrow papers, expressed confusion. "Colonel, I must express uncertainty about your instructions regarding the mulatto boy Sam. The other Negroes have noticed the special treatment, which breeds discontent. Moreover, teaching reading is illegal and could bring trouble should authorities learn of it. I await your clarification of what purpose this serves." Harrow's reply was terse. "Your uncertainty is noted and dismissed. Follow instructions exactly as given. The boy's education serves purposes beyond your concern." An account book from a Savannah tailor shows orders placed by Harrow in Sam's name, clothing of quality far exceeding what enslaved people typically wore. In October 1854, 2 cotton shirts, good cloth, 2 pairs wool trousers, 1 jacket of serviceable broadcloth, boots, $23.50. This was approximately what a skilled white workman might spend on clothing annually. Other enslaved people at Marshfield were issued rough Negro cloth once or twice yearly, coarse fabric that marked their status as clearly as any legal document. The education progressed. Mr. Patterson's records, discovered among his estate papers, include notes on Sam's instruction. The boy is remarkably quick. He learned his letters within a month and now reads simple texts fluently. His arithmetic is equally advanced. He can calculate figures that many white boys his age cannot. His situation is irregular, and I confess myself uncertain about the propriety of this instruction. But Colonel Harrow insists and pays well for my discretion. In 1856, Harrow wrote to Ashe, "Sam is not to be hired out for any labor outside Marshfield. When the other boys are leased to the railroad construction, Sam remains here. Put him to work in the garden where he can be supervised. His education continues. Mr. Patterson reports excellent progress." Refusing to lease out an enslaved teenager during peak earning years was economically irrational. Young male labor commanded good rates in Georgia's booming infrastructure development. But Harrow protected Sam from the brutal conditions of railroad work that killed or maimed many enslaved laborers. Yet this protection coexisted with the fundamental violence of enslavement. Sam remained legally property. A letter from 1857 records Harrow's instruction. "The boy showed impudence when directed to clean the stables. You will discipline him appropriately, but no permanent marking. He is valuable. The dehumanizing calculus of that phrase, discipline the human being I have educated and privileged, but preserve the monetary value of my property, crystallizes the contradiction at the heart of Sam's existence. The enslaved community at Marshfield understood what white observers could not or would not see. Caesar Brownwell, formerly enslaved at Marshfield, told a WPA interviewer, "Everybody knew that Boy Sam was Colonel's kin. He had the Harrow look about him, something in how he carried himself, in his features. Colonel treated him different, but he kept him slave all the same. That's what was so terrible about it. The man was educating his own blood, dressing him decent, but wouldn't free him, kept him in chains, just invisible chains instead of iron." By 1859, as sectional tensions mounted toward war, Harrow's letters reveal increasing anxiety about Sam's fate. In the event of hostilities, provisions must be made for certain property of sensitive nature. I will provide sealed instructions to be opened only in circumstance of my death or incapacitation. What those sealed instructions contained remains unknown. If they ever existed, they were destroyed or lost during the chaos of war and its aftermath. But the phrasing suggests Harrow recognized that his death would leave Sam vulnerable, without even the questionable protection of Harrow's patriarchal interest. By 1859, the contradictions inherent in Sam's situation had become impossible to fully conceal. An enslaved teenager who read books, who wore decent clothes, who was addressed with relative courtesy by the colonel, but who remained legally chattel. This violated every social script by which antebellum society organized itself. Rumors circulated through the white community, while in the enslaved quarters, Sam's situation became a parable about slavery's fundamental cruelty. A diary entry by Catherine Winthrop, who visited Marshfield in November 1859, records her impression. "Colonel Harrow introduced us to his people, including a youth of perhaps 17, remarkably light in complexion, who was described as a house servant. I was startled by his resemblance to portraits of the Harrow family, something in the structure of his face, the set of his eyes. At dinner, Mrs. Winthrop remarked upon it sotto voce, but our host affected not to hear. The young man served at table with competence, but also with an air of profound melancholy that haunted me." Another visitor's account is more explicit. "I observed that the mulatto boy called Sam bore such striking resemblance to Miss Eleanor that I took him initially for a young relative in reduced circumstances. When informed he was enslaved, I confess myself shocked." The colonel's treatment of the boy suggested some connection beyond the usual master-servant relation. He was firm but not harsh, correcting his service with the irritated familiarity one might use with a wayward nephew. I did not press for explanation, as Southern hospitality forbids such impertinence, but I departed Marshfield deeply troubled. The moment when Sam's education could no longer be hidden came in the spring of 1860. Flora Mason recalled, "Sam was in the library. The colonel let him read books sometimes, and he must have gotten absorbed in what he was reading, because he didn't hear people coming. Miss Eleanor brought some ladies through to show them the house, and they found Sam sitting in the colonel's chair, reading from a book. One of the ladies just gasped out loud. Miss Eleanor went pale as death. She got those ladies out of there quick, but the story spread." The consequences of this exposure were severe, but complicated. Harrow could not punish Sam too harshly, without prompting questions about why an enslaved teenager had access to books in the first place. But neither could he allow such a violation of social boundaries to pass without response. The solution reflected the perverse logic of slavery. Sam was publicly whipped, 20 lashes, while privately his education continued. Flora Mason's testimony captures the psychological torture of this moment. They whipped him in the yard where everybody could see. Miss Eleanor, she stood at her window watching, and she was crying so hard her whole body shook. The colonel, he stood there with his face like stone, not showing nothing. After, Sam was brought back to his shed, and the colonel had the doctor tend to his back. Sent good food from the kitchen. But that boy had been whipped by his own grandfather's orders, and for the crime of reading, something his grandfather insisted he learn. How do you make sense of that? Sam's response to this trauma went unrecorded in any document, but the psychological impact must have been devastating. To be educated, then punished for the fruits of that education. To be treated with relative gentleness, then subjected to public violence. To exist in the space between recognition and denial. This was the special cruelty inflicted on enslaved children who were also their master's biological descendants. They were simultaneously seen and erased, claimed and disavowed, valued and violated. By late 1860, as South Carolina moved toward secession, and Georgia planters debated whether to follow, the Harrow household existed in a state of suspended crisis. Sam, now 18, worked in the house and grounds, educated enough to keep accounts but forbidden from demonstrating that knowledge publicly, close enough to the family to understand their conversations, but excluded from any claim to kinship. He had become a living embodiment of slavery's central lie, that blood and law could be separated, that genealogy could be nullified by legislation, that a grandfather could own his grandson and call it natural order. The accounts from enslaved witnesses suggest that Sam himself understood the grotesque absurdity of his position. Caesar Brownwell remembered, "Sam, he got quiet as he got older. Used to be he'd talk to us in the quarters sometimes, but after that whipping, after it became clear what he was and what he'd never be allowed to be, he kept to himself mostly. But I heard him once, talking to himself in the garden. He was saying, 'Yes, sir,' and 'No, sir,' over and over, like he was practicing how to make himself smaller, how to disappear into what they wanted him to be." In the white community, those who suspected the truth maintained a conspiracy of silence. To acknowledge Sam's lineage would be to acknowledge that Colonel Harrow had permitted his daughter's child to remain enslaved, a scandal that would destroy Harrow's reputation as a Christian gentleman. It would also require confronting the foundational hypocrisy of a system that claimed to be based on inherent racial difference, while routinely producing mixed-race children through rape and coercion. Easier to say nothing, to look away, to preserve the fiction that enabled the entire brutal structure to continue. Miss Eleanor's anguish, however, leaked through the cracks of this enforced silence. Her letters to Margaret from this period take on a tone of barely controlled desperation. "I am haunted, dear cousin, by the thought of what I have lost and what continues daily before my eyes, so close I could touch it, yet infinitely distant. I pray for strength to endure what God and Father have decreed I must endure. But I confess the weight grows heavier with each passing year. Sometimes I think the watching is worse than the initial separation, to see him and know him, and yet be required to treat him as something other than what he is." The phrase that would echo through subsequent testimonies, that Sam would call the colonel sir in public and father when no one was near, cannot be definitively confirmed, as no written record captures such an intimate moment. But multiple formerly enslaved witnesses reported hearing this or hearing about it from others who claimed to have overheard. Whether literally true or a crystallization of the psychological truth of their relationship. The story captures something essential: the double life Sam was forced to live, the code switching between his legal status and his genealogical reality, the constant performance of subordination to a man whose blood he shared. As Georgia moved toward secession in January 1861, plantation discipline intensified. Slaveholders, anxious about potential rebellion in a time of white disunity, cracked down on any behavior that suggested independence or resistance. Sam's education, already a dangerous secret, became untenable in this climate of heightened surveillance and fear. Harrow wrote to his overseer in February 1861, "Instruction for Sam will cease immediately. Mr. Patterson will not return. The boy is to be employed in field work with the others. Current circumstances require absolute conformity to expected social order." After 6 years of education and relative privilege, Sam was relegated to the rice fields, a demotion that plantation witnesses described as crushing him in both body and spirit. The archival trail for Sam ends abruptly in March 1861, just weeks after Georgia seceded from the Union. In the Marshfield Plantation Ledger, his name appears in the March inventory as Sam Mulatto, age 18, value $1,200. This would be the last time his name was recorded in any document associated with the Harrow estate. From this point forward, Sam vanished, not just from records, but from the careful oral histories preserved by the enslaved community, not just from the census, but from family memory, not just from legal documentation, but from every form of evidence that might testify to his existence and fate. Multiple scenarios could explain this disappearance, each reflecting a different aspect of the chaos and violence that characterized the Civil War era in coastal Georgia. The most optimistic interpretation, that Sam escaped to freedom in the confusion of war, finds little support in available evidence. Union forces did not reach coastal Georgia until late 1861, and even then, the path to freedom was treacherous. Young men attempting to reach Union lines faced patrols, dogs, and summary execution if captured. No record exists of a Sam or Samuel Harrow among the formerly enslaved people who made their way to Union camps, though record-keeping in those desperate circumstances was often haphazard. A darker possibility emerges from fragmentary testimony about conditions at Marshfield during the war years. As Union forces threatened coastal plantations, many slaveholders moved their enslaved people inland to prevent them from escaping to Union lines. Flora Mason recalled, "When the war started getting serious, the colonel sent a lot of folks away from Marshfield, sold some, moved others to upcountry plantations. We heard Sam was sent away, but nobody knew exactly where. Some said Alabama, some said Carolina. We never saw him again at Marshfield." The practice of refugeeing, moving enslaved people away from approaching Union forces, separated thousands of families, and often resulted in harsh conditions and higher mortality rates. If Sam was refugeed, he would have been torn from the only home he could remember, despite its cruelties, and sent to work for strangers in unfamiliar territory. The careful protection Harrow had extended, however compromised and conditional, would have evaporated in such a transfer. He would have become just another enslaved worker, his education meaningless, his genealogy unknown or unacknowledged. Another possibility, whispered in some accounts but impossible to verify, is that Sam died during the war years, either from disease, which ravaged both military and civilian populations, or from violence. Several formerly enslaved witnesses mentioned hearing that Sam had taken ill or met with an accident, phrases that could mask everything from natural death to murder. The incentive for violence was clear. Sam knew too much, represented too great a scandal. In the social collapse of war, eliminating a living reminder of family shame might have seemed not just possible but prudent. The most chilling aspect of Sam's disappearance is its thoroughness. When federal forces occupied the Georgia coast in 1862, 1863, and began enrolling formerly enslaved men in the Union Army, no Sam or Samuel with any connection to the Harrow family appears in military records. When the Freedmen's Bureau began operating in 1865, registering formerly enslaved people and helping them locate separated family members, no one matching Sam's description inquired about the Harrow family or claimed any connection to Marshfield. When the 1870 census recorded millions of newly free black Southerners establishing their lives and families in freedom, no Samuel Harrow appears anywhere in Georgia or surrounding states. This absence is itself evidence of how completely a person could be erased when those with power willed it. Evidence of how slavery's violence extended beyond physical bondage into the destruction of identity and history itself. Sam was not merely enslaved, but rendered genealogically impossible, excised from the family tree, deleted from the historical record as thoroughly as if he had never existed. The only trace he left was the margin note that began this inquiry. Purchased back, age 11. A fragment that survived because even Colonel Harrow could not resist marking, however cryptically, the transaction that revealed so much about slavery's grotesque arithmetic. Miss Eleanor Harrow survived the war, living until 1889 in the partially destroyed Marshfield house. Her later letters, few of which survive, suggest a woman consumed by grief and guilt. In one letter to her cousin Margaret, written in 1872, she reflected, "I have lived to see slavery destroyed, yet I find no peace in this justice. The one I would most wish to see restored to liberty and dignity was lost long before emancipation, lost to choices I was too weak and too obedient to resist. I am haunted not by what was done to me, but by what I permitted to be done to him, first in consenting to his removal as an infant, then in accepting his return as property rather than demanding his recognition as kin. I am told one must forgive oneself to find Christian peace, but I cannot fathom what forgiveness would mean for such failures." Colonel Silas Harrow died in 1866, his fortune largely destroyed by Confederate bonds and war damage to Marshfield. His obituaries praised his service, his Christian charity, his devotion to the lost cause. Not one mentioned the grandson he had sold, repurchased, educated, enslaved, and finally erased from memory. His papers, carefully curated by descendants before being donated to the Georgia Historical Society, contained no personal reflections on Sam, no acknowledgement of the relationship, no explanation for his decisions. The private man who wrote those anxious letters to his overseer, who paid premium prices to buy back a child he had sold, vanished behind the public monument of the honorable colonel and philanthropist. The Harrow family line continued through Eleanor's brother's children. She herself died childless, at least in terms of any children recognized by law or society. The 20th century descendants knew nothing of Sam, or claimed to know nothing. The family narrative, preserved in genealogies and local histories, presented a simple story. Honorable ancestors who had owned slaves, as everyone did in that time and place, but who had treated them with relative kindness. The complexity, the incest of economics and genealogy, the grandson in bondage, all this was forgotten or suppressed. Yet the margin note survived, pressed between the pages of a plantation ledger, waiting for a graduate student in 2019 to lift it into light. Purchased back, age 11. Those 3 words along with the fragments of letters and testimonies, allow us to reconstruct, however partially, a life that was meant to be forgotten. We cannot know what Sam thought or felt, cannot recover his voice or perspective. The archive is fundamentally shaped by power, and enslaved people's interior lives rarely left direct traces. But we can bear witness to what was done to him, can name the particular cruelty of being enslaved by one's own grandfather, can insist that his erasure was not complete, because we remember now that he existed. This is the final silence we must resist, the silence that would allow such stories to remain buried, that would preserve the comfort of sanitized family histories at the cost of truth. Sam's story, fragmentary as it is, testifies to slavery's most intimate violences, the ways it twisted kinship into property, love into exploitation, blood ties into legal ownership. It reveals how thoroughly white supremacy corrupted even those relationships that should have been protected by family feeling, how completely the logic of racial capitalism overrode every other moral consideration. We do not know where Sam is buried, if he was buried with any marker at all. We do not know what name he died with, what life he might have lived in freedom, had freedom come sooner, or had his grandfather possessed the moral courage to manumit him. We do not know if he married, had children, left descendants who carry his genes, even as they know nothing of his history. All we know is what the margin note tells us, that he existed, that he was bought and sold and bought again, that his grandfather chose ownership over acknowledgement, property over kinship, right up until the moment when Sam vanished into the silence that swallows the powerless. That margin note and the story it unlocks stands as a permanent indictment of the system that made such horrors routine. It reminds us that slavery was not merely an economic system or a political arrangement, but a moral catastrophe that poisoned every relationship it touched, including and especially the relationships between parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, family and blood. And it challenges us, in our own time, to excavate these buried histories, to speak the names that were meant to be forgotten, to insist that the silences of the archive are not the silences of consent, but the silences of violence that we must work to overcome.